The streets of Moscow are not celebrating victories or parading soldiers. Instead, they're choking with endless lines of cars, stretching for miles, filled with desperate drivers clutching empty jerry cans. The air is heavy with anger and disbelief. This isn't the aftermath of a natural disaster. It's not even the ruins of a war fought on Russian soil. What Russia faces now is far more dangerous for the Kremlin, a silent catastrophe eating away at the foundations of its power. For the first time in decades, the so-called energy superpower is running dry. The empire that built its strength on oil and gas is now crumbling from within. Gasoline lines resemble the darkest days of the Soviet collapse. Factories are falling silent. Harvests rot in the fields. Workers, once the pride of Russia's industrial machine, are being sent home indefinitely. And beneath the surface, whispers spread like wildfire. Has Putin's war finally struck at the heart of Russia's survival, its oil lifeline? Millions of Russians, once convinced that the country's reserves were endless, now stand in disbelief, realizing the promises of abundance were little more than illusions. This crisis isn't about one broken pipeline or a temporary glitch. It's about the unraveling of an entire system, one that powers everything from tanks to tractors, from war machines to dinner tables. The Kremlin has long claimed Russia was untouchable, but today, with crops rotting and factories silent, that illusion is shattering. And the story of how this nightmare unfolded reveals not only the fragility of Putin's empire, but also the terrifying consequences for the world beyond Russia's borders. At gas stations across Russia, the scene looks surreal. People wait for hours, even days, only to hear the same devastating words when they finally reach the pump. It's gone. This isn't an inconvenience. It's the breakdown of an entire system. Factories that once produced steel, chemicals, and machinery now stand idle, their engines cold. Truck fleets, without diesel, sit rusting in depots. In small towns, workers are forced onto unpaid leave, their future uncertain. Even Russia's war economy, which consumed fuel like a bottomless pit, is beginning to wobble. Tanks and jets are useless without gasoline. The collapse doesn't end with machines. It's spreading to Russia's dinner tables. In fertile farmlands of the south, wheat stands unharvested, tractors unable to move. Grain, once used by Moscow as a geopolitical weapon, is now stranded in the soil. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, whispers grow that bread prices are about to double. For a nation that prided itself on feeding the world, the idea of struggling to feed its own people is a humiliation. The Kremlin's desperate solution? Ban gasoline exports. Officials declared this would ensure domestic supply until at least October, but the move backfired. Yes, a trickle of fuel stayed home, but foreign revenues collapsed. Every ruble lost from exports is a ruble missing from Putin's war chest. And in a war that drains billions each month, the cracks widen quickly. On the ground, reality can't be hidden. Drivers scream in long lines, fights break out, and in some places, mobs storm gas stations when pumps run dry. For older Russians, the chaos brings back haunting memories of the Soviet ration coupons. But for younger generations, raised on Putin's promises, it feels like betrayal. They mutter bitterly, "This isn't history class, we're living." But the question haunting the Kremlin is simple. How did Russia, the so-called energy empire, run out of fuel? The answer lies in Ukraine's relentless assault on Russia's oil infrastructure. In cities like Ryazan, Samara, Volgograd, and Leningrad, massive refineries once stood as monuments to Russia's energy might. Now, they are smoldering ruins, hammered by swarms of drones and precision missile strikes. Washington confirmed what ordinary Russians already suspected. Refinery capacity had collapsed by nearly 20% in a matter of weeks. This wasn't a temporary supply hiccup. It was a structural collapse of the system that powered not just civilian life, but Moscow's war machine. The Kremlin scrambled to cover it up. State television insisted there was no crisis. Officials repeated that the pumps were flowing, but Russians standing in endless lines knew the truth. Gas stations rationed, factories shuttered, and fuel reserves vanished faster than they could be replaced. Every refinery fire symbolized something larger. It wasn't just infrastructure under attack. It was the illusion of invincibility. Ukraine had turned Russia's greatest strength into its greatest vulnerability, and what frightened Moscow most was the realization that it could do little to stop it. The strikes also carried a psychological weight. Russians were raised to believe their homeland was vast and untouchable, protected by distance and defenses. Yet week after week, explosions lit up the skies deep inside Russia, revealing just how vulnerable the heartland had become. And while ordinary people braced for survival, Russia's elites were beginning to feel the pressure in ways they hadn't for decades. For Russia's oligarchs, the fuel crisis wasn't just about shortages, it was about survival. Men like Igor Sechin, Gennady Timchenko, and Leonid Mikhelson had built their power on oil money, but suddenly, that golden river was reduced to a trickle. Rosneft, Lukoil, Novatek, even Gazprom Neft, once untouchable giants, now struggle under sanctions, collapsing revenues, and relentless strikes. Their shadow fleets, once used to sneak oil around sanctions, now bleed money on skyrocketing insurance and freight costs. The once luxurious lifestyles of Moscow's billionaires are slipping away. Yachts sit idle, fortunes evaporate, and with wealth disappearing, loyalty to Putin begins to crack. Their allegiance was never about ideology. It was always about money and security. But as profits vanish and risks mount, whispers circulate in Moscow's gilded circles. What if there's another way? Rumors suggest that some oligarchs have even floated alternatives. Negotiations, concessions, maybe even peace talks, anything to stop the bleeding. None of it is confirmed, of course, but the mere fact that such talk exists signals how fragile Putin's once monolithic power structure has become. Still, while the rich whispered, ordinary Russians live the chaos in raw, daily reality. Across Russia, from the far east in Primorsky to central Tatarstan, desperation became a way of life. People arrived at gas stations carrying bottles, buckets, even children's toys repurposed as makeshift fuel containers. Anything to grab a few liters of gasoline. Tensions boiled over. Drivers screamed at each other. Fistfights erupted in lines stretching for hours. In some towns, mobs attacked gas stations after waiting all day, only to find pumps running dry. For the older generation, these scenes triggered painful memories of Soviet rationing. They remembered standing with coupons in the 1980s, waiting endlessly for basic necessities. But for younger Russians, raised in the era of Putin's promises, this was something else entirely, a betrayal. They had grown up believing Russia was a mighty superpower, immune to shortages. Now, standing in endless lines, they muttered bitterly about the lies they'd been fed. The crisis wasn't just economic, it was emotional. It stripped away faith in the state's ability to protect its people. Every empty pump, every rotting field of wheat, every idle tractor became a symbol of broken promises. And beyond Russia's borders, the shockwaves were only beginning. Russia's refining collapse isn't a domestic problem. It's a global one. Diesel, the backbone of global trade, powers everything from trucks to trains, from cargo ships to farming equipment. With Russia unable to refine and export fuel, shortages ripple across continents. In Berlin, minibus fleets struggled with rising costs. In Sao Paulo, shoppers complained as food prices soared. In Istanbul, farmers watched fuel expenses eat away at profits. In Jakarta, cargo terminals slowed as fuel became scarce. Every Ukrainian drone strike inside Russia reverberated across oceans. Prices spiked, supply chains strained, and ordinary people, thousands of miles away, paid the price. The war had leapt far beyond the battlefield. This global impact added to the Kremlin's nightmare. The world could now see that Russia wasn't the stable supplier it claimed to be. Its energy system was fragile, outdated, and vulnerable to every new Ukrainian strike. And as fuel exports dwindled, so too did Russia's leverage on the world stage. But the true turning point didn't come from economics alone. It came from technology and Ukraine's ability to innovate under pressure. In the early days of the war, Ukraine depended heavily on Western-provided drones. But necessity breeds innovation. Today, Ukraine has built a domestic drone industry that churns out hundreds of explosive FPV drones every day. Through reverse engineering, 3D printing, and local chip assembly, Ukraine became a drone powerhouse. These swarms of cheap, disposable drones overwhelmed Russia's expensive air defenses. Even the much-hyped S-400 batteries couldn't cover Russia's vast territory. Every gap in coverage became a target. Ukraine exploited those weaknesses with precision. Strikes reached not only border depots, but deep into Russia's heartland, hitting Engels Air Base, fuel depots in Belgorod, and refineries hundreds of miles from the front. NATO satellites and reconnaissance gave pinpoint accuracy, ensuring Ukraine struck not just where Russia was weakest, but when it was least prepared. The result was devastating. The illusion of an impregnable Russian homeland shattered. Russians who had long believed in their nation's untouchability now watched explosions light up their skies. The psychological toll of that reality cannot be overstated. And for the Kremlin, the question was no longer just about oil or gasoline. It was about survival itself.
So,
Where does Russia go from here? Analysts outline three possible futures, each more grim than the last. In the first scenario, Ukraine's strikes continue at their current pace. Russia is left permanently crippled, with 20% of its refining capacity destroyed. Fuel rationing becomes the new normal. Factories collapse. The war economy eats itself alive. In the second scenario, Russia somehow accelerates repairs and strengthens defenses, but the financial cost is crushing. Budgets would be slashed, taxes raised, and ordinary Russians would bear the weight. Social unrest would grow, loyalty to the Kremlin would erode, and even survival would feel like defeat. The third scenario, the least likely, involves some form of diplomacy, negotiations, concessions, even peace talks. But this would require a level of political will Putin has never shown. For now, it seems more fantasy than reality. What is clear is that Moscow is trapped in a vicious cycle, repairing, losing, and repairing again, while Ukrainian drones strike deeper each month. The Kremlin's options shrink by the day. This crisis is about more than fuel. It's about the survival of a regime built on energy, wealth, war. From Moscow's endless fuel lines to rotting harvests, from idle factories to anxious oligarchs, the unraveling is plain to see. The Kremlin once declared that Russia was untouchable, a fortress shielded by resources, territory, and power. But today that fortress looks fragile. Its oil empire is crumbling. Its people are disillusioned. Its enemies are striking deep into its heart. And in the silence of factory, in the rot of unharvested fields, in the fury of empty fuel lines, one truth echoes across Russia. The empire built on oil is no longer secure. The nightmare has begun, and it is one the Kremlin cannot easily wake